Good morning and welcome to this week's Jump recruitment discussion. This week we're going to break a little bit from the norm because this week we're going to talk about setting business targets and goals, and are you setting targets that inspire? So we are going to break from the norm, and the reason why we're going to break from the norm is rather than sort of have questions, we ask questions and we all bounce around the questions. We're going to sort of give you a bit more of a presentation this week on our views and thoughts of setting goals and targets based on our experiences and how we can sort of help you people set better targets that inspire and drive your staff, and look at reasons why potentially that they're not working. And so I think where we're going to start off, Paul, there's Paul and I today on here. Heather's with client site, and Dave is actually out over in Israel with a client as well, so it's he can't join us today. So I think we're going to kick off on this, Paul, in a way. And I think the thing that we start to talk about is when we look at the sort of where we are, is that difference between a target and a goal. And so I thought I'd put this sort of definition up that you can Google and take off Google. And a target is an indicator to establish or determine how successful you are as achieving your objectives, and a goal is an indicator to establish and to determine whether you have achieved your objective. So I think the question is, what is a goal? And I think a goal can be defined primarily as the ambition that people cherish time and against what they're looking to achieve. So as human beings, I think we all have goals in life, and they can be personal goals or professional goals. And I think it's about leading a happy life and a happy work balance. And I think that's where our goals sort of go into. So if you look in our professional sort of life, if you are to achieve your highest potential, for example, a recruiter can dream about being a manager one day, and that's that person's ultimate goal. But it's the targets that they need to set then to get that goal. So the word target then refers to their aims in general, and that's to me a figurative sort of meaning of distance or a mark that they need to achieve. And so I think, for example, to go back to that, the target of our recruiter, what they need is, look at their yearly targets, look at their performance targets in their niche, look at how they're managing people that are below them without being a manager, etc. That's their targets they need to achieve to hit their overall goal. So I think it's important to establish that the two are different, that you have the ultimate goal for the business, and then with everyone you have their collective targets individually that helps drive the business towards that ultimate goal. And I think consultants need to have constant and consistent targets to achieve their own goals, and that would be micro targets of the overall business goal that the corporation and the business is trying to achieve. And that's the way I sort of look at goals, Paul, from my point of view.
Well, you would. I mean, Leeds don't score many goals, do they? So, I mean, it's something that you would have to look at it from that perspective.
Here we go.
I would agree. I completely agree, and I think it's an interesting definition that you've outlined. You'd like to think that we've all of us got goals in life, goals in our professional lives, goals in our personal lives, where we want to be, the dream of where we want to get to, whether that's professional fulfillment or what we want to achieve in our personal lives. And those can be, I think, defined very clearly as goals. What's really important, I think, for any organisation is to understand the individual goals for every person that works in the business. I mean, we talk, as you've just done, about the corporate goal. Where's the business going? What is it we want to achieve, and by when? And the goals aren't always related to the revenue figures, although obviously we all focus on that. Goals can be other things. Goals can be about being a market leader, looking at a standout marketing or brand position. There can be a whole range of goals for an organisation. And when we look at employer value proposition, I think when you consider what that is all about, that's all about goals, how the business is going to be defined, how you would like to see your business defined by your competitors, by your candidates, by your clients. They're not just about revenue. But when you look at goals, you've also got to look at everybody's individual goals within the business. What do they want? What do these human beings that work with you want to achieve as they start to grow? Where do they want to go in their lives, and professionally and personally? And then, as you say, Howard, the difference then is the targets. How are we going to get to those goals? And again, not just revenue targets. We all in our individual businesses tend to fixate on revenue, and that's again completely understandable. But we often talk about the inputs to get the outputs, outputs being the revenue, the inputs are the actual activities that you put in on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to achieve those outcomes. So, I think these are two different things. This to me is related to how close you should be to your staff, to your people, understanding their goals and then helping them by defining the targets to help them to achieve the goals. And as you've said, the collective targets of the individuals that work in the business are all about achieving the goal of the organization. So there is a distinct difference between the two. And I think, if you take away the sort of mathematics and you look at it from a personal perspective, understanding what your individual colleagues want out of their lives, professionally and personally, is where you should begin to see whether they're aligned with the goals of the business.
So let's move this on a little bit, because I think this is the bit where we start to talk about when we collate and pull these goals together and what they look like. And I think we're going to talk we're going to flip flop across certain bits all the time today from there. So I think the next sort of slide is all about growth and what's acceptable. Is it 20? Is it 30% growth, etc.? We'll talk about what's acceptable a little bit later on. But I think that bit about setting goals is really important. And you and I have this conversation quite a lot, that goals need to be personal to the individual. They need to be set, I think, in the present tense. So everyone use SMART objectives, which is fine. But I always think SMART objectives doesn't really make it personal. So you need to make it personal to the individual and set in the present tense. And then the consultant needs to focus on those goals. And I think targets, we need to be realistic, because I think, yes, you can achieve 100% growth, but in realistic terms, what does that look like? Setting unrealistic goals, I think, for targets and billers is one thing. Setting unrealistic goals for managers is another thing. And that has a far deeper impact on the business if the managers don't feel that they can achieve their goals. So all managers, I think, have an impact on the gross margin line more than anything else. And only a small percentage of managers actually have an impact on the actual cost line and therefore on the actual profit line that they work. So if you strangle your manager with unrealistic targets on that gross profit line, then the ripple effect down the chain, I think, that happens, and it affects the billers as the management line has more influence over billers. So setting realistic targets can be achieved. So as I said, there's nothing wrong with having 100% targets. If you looked at a company that maybe billed 500k last year with 3 billers, and they've got 3 new billers in their business now, and they're all on a run rate of, let's say, £16,000 a month, then they'll bill £1 million. Absolutely. They'll do that. But if you then look at a business that maybe has a team of 6 billers doing $1 million, they need 12 billers to do 2 million the following year. So it's that sudden growth. And as we know, the expansion in recruitment is huge, but we also know the attrition rate in recruitment is huge. So it's very difficult to get those people in, and they have to have that run rate to enable them to achieve the magical figure that you're trying to attain or trying to sort of grow from there. So you've got to make sure that you motivate, not demotivate your people. And I think the way that I've looked at it here, Paul, if you took your average billers or took a number of billers with over 12 months experience, okay, they're the ones that should be at the run rate that you're looking at. If you then take that one, times it by the annual gross margin of the per billers, that gives you whereabouts your target or what their capabilities should be. Times it by the percentage growth that you want, and you can see what you have to uplift or how you're going to uplift that target to them. You then add what's expected from your new starters or your consultants with less than 12 months, but then you've got to minus the expected attrition rate from the billers with over 12 months experience that will potentially leave your business. And that starts to give you a really understanding of where your business is. So is your 20% too big a leap? Is 100% too big a leap? Is it not enough? But without understanding where your primary billers are, I think it's very hard to suddenly say we want to double our target or triple our target. You have to understand what the people inside the business are capable of, and then look at how you can stretch and grow them.
I mean, I think you've got the mathematics up there. There's a number of other things you can add to this particular slide.
Yeah.
But I think that you've got to look beyond this as well, and other things that you'd absolutely consider would be, have people the previous year overperformed? Have they actually done far better than we could reasonably expect? Is it reasonable to expect them to even match last year's performance, let alone beat it? So there's things like that to consider. Then you look at the underperformers in your business who have had more than 12 months experience. You'd expect them to show an improvement. I think you talk here about the newbies. Obviously, we know that when you bring a new person into a business, first 3 months, they're not going to bill anything much. Second 3 months, maybe a few placements, a little bit of revenue. And in the final 6 months, you expect them to be getting into their stride. And so into the second year, we now expect a reasonably decent performance from them. So that you take that into consideration. You make the point about attrition, obviously, and we don't want it, but some people do leave the business. Occasionally, there are people that are high billers. You have to consider that too. But around all of that, you've also got to look at the market, the condition of the market, what's going on, and the only way you know that stuff is to be very, very super tight to your clients to understand what their sentiments are about the 12 months ahead. I remember back in my Office Angels days when I was a branch manager, as we used to call them, in advance of doing the having to set the budgets, which we were obviously involved in, we were commanded to go and speak to all of our clients about what they wanted from us in the next 12 months, what their sentiments were, so that we could feed that in to the budget process. So, if somebody had spent a lot of money with me in the previous 12 months, there was no guarantee they were going to carry on doing that in the next 12 months. And we hoped they would, but you didn't know that. Occasionally, of course, you'd speak to clients and discover happily that they were going to spend a lot of money with you in the next 12 months. So it was understanding their sentiments. And obviously candidates tell you a great deal about what's going on in the market. In fact, it's the greatest source of intelligence that we have. It comes from the candidates we speak to on a daily basis. All of those things go into the round. I think a lot of it is also underpinned by learning and development. It's one thing to say we expect X amount of growth from people. Absolutely. But how are we going to get them there? What are we going to do to support them, to train them, to develop them? These things are super important. And then aligned to all of those things would be client-based growth. Where's our client base going to be? If you want to get to 20% growth, 50%, 100% growth, okay, great. I'm up for that. Who's going to spend the money with us? Where is this money going to come from? Who are the clients that are going to spend more money with us? Upselling, cross-selling, new client acquisitions, and so forth. All of those things will come to, I think, later, need to be reviewed and considered very strongly. Plus, especially at the moment with inflation running at over 10%, how are we going to increase our fee levels? Not because we're greedy, not because we're taking advantage in a candidate short market, but because we have to increase our fee levels to keep on top of inflation, or at least close to it, at over 10% at the moment. All of those things need to be pushed into that mix that you discuss on that slide, Howard, to start to come to some reasonable levels of forecasting. The other thing, and I'll just pick up your point very quickly, and that is to say, it's important that people buy in. Commanding people to do 100% increase is one thing, but if they think it's impossible because it is impossible, then you're going to start your year with people suffering from poor morale and the sharks swimming around them looking to take them from your business to work for them. So trying to find the right level where we're stretching people to a point where we think they can get to with a real push, but not to a point where we think it's impossible. Trying to set that line is important too.
So everything that you've talked about there is absolutely what we're going to talk about further down on the slides that we're looking at, because I think what you're talking about there is when we start to look at what our billers are capable of, you've then got to look at the gap of what do your clients want, what do your clients going to do, what's the market doing, etc., which we'll talk to. But I think that first stage is to look at what the billers on average are capable of doing, and then you can start to set your goals from there. So we'll move back to that, Paul, and come back to that in a later slide, but that's absolutely right. And I think the biggest side is when you start to look at that, you talked about morale and you talk about things that sort of motivate and inspire people, and if they don't feel inspired, then they're not going to sort of move forward. So I think when you start to look at that, one team how to get everyone on the same page is really important. And I think, when we talk about setting goals, setting targets, setting objectives, we were both at the Adecco group when they would come down and they give you your enormous target to try and achieve. And you knew full well it was a thankless task, but you had to sort of work out how you do that and what we do. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on with data. But we would talk about constantly about everyone knowing the business objective. What is the business objective? Where is the business going to? And that means that everyone needs to know their team goals. What's their team? What's their individual input into that team? And then it goes back down to that individual person knowing their goals and knowing their targets. And then it's monitoring that progress, reviewing performance and coaching and developing your team to sort of get there. And I think this goes back when we talk about the terror of management. That E is all about expectation, isn't it? If everyone knows where they're going and what's expected of them, then it really starts to motivate them into the right direction. However, the bigger problem with that is that if you make them feel as they are not important, i.e. the rank in terror, and they don't feel important because you're trying to absolutely strangle them with huge targets, then that motivation drops and that motivation disappears very, very quickly. And it's very hard then to re-motivate and re-energize those people to try and hit the targets that they just generally do not think are realistic. And I think it's important that when you are rolling your targets out, you roll out what the business objective is, and then individual teams or individual goals and targets to make sure people can get there, and then keep that conversation high and keep that level of conversation going all the way through the year so people know where they are and know what they're doing. And I think it's important that we set that aside, that motivation comes from your communication of the targets and then how people are performing against their individual goals and targets.
I mean, look, you've used the phrase here, Howard, one team. I love that. I think that's really important. It's tough out there. We've had a very, very, very good return since COVID. It's not gone away, but since COVID kind of dissipated and we went back to work. I mean, it's been a great run. Last winter was extraordinary, and this year's continued to be very strong. We know that we're entering a period that's going to be choppier, shall we say. I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. It's not going to be, in my opinion, fall off the edge of a cliff the stuff that we went through with COVID, but it's definitely going to be a more difficult winter than we had last year. Getting everybody on the same page is vitally important. We have a better chance of beating our competitors and making sure we hit our goals if we work together, if there's synergy, if there's collaboration and mutual support in the business. And of course, if I think back to my own experiences, some of the things that have been most memorable in my career with businesses I've been managing have been at points where we've been backs against the wall. Everybody, it's been really tough. And just getting everybody on the same page, getting morale very high, having fun, instead of being frightened of the situation, really attacking it with some zeal, and a sense of absolute belief. When you've got that going on in your business, everybody pulling together, running through walls for each other, then you can beat anything. It doesn't matter about the economy. You can take business from your competitors. So this one team on the same page heading, I think, is absolutely and completely vital. And this comes back to the point I made earlier, getting close to every member of your team, understanding their personal goals, their personal motivations, their drivers, what they want, and trying very hard to get that to gel in the team so that you're very aware of everybody's motivations. I think those things are extremely important. I think this slide particularly talks to communication, because we talk here about knowing their goals and targets, monitoring progress, reviewing performance, coaching and developing your team. If you were going to put one word and wrap it around all of that, I think you'd talk about communication. And I think that if you are moving into perhaps more difficult times, and I don't want to worry anybody or panic anybody, because I think we'll be fine. But if we are definitely moving into more challenging times, then heightening your level of communication both within the business and outside the business with your clients and candidates, I mentioned already, but also individually with everybody becomes really, really super important. And that old adage about you're only as good as the things you can monitor is very true. You've put it on there. It's one thing setting targets and agreeing targets, people knowing what their goals and targets are. It's an entirely different matter as a manager, as a leader, to be, have your finger on the pulse, to know exactly what's going on at any given moment. That doesn't mean you spend hours and hours poring over spreadsheets, but you're close enough to your people and close enough to your clients, close enough even to the basics of knowing what live jobs are available and where we are with them and the candidates we should be working on and so forth. And
So,
knowing what those daily targets are, that's important.
yeah, but obviously what we've got to think about is that these are about setting targets and goals and objectives, and it's getting that initial conversation going and exciting people. And again, it goes back to that conversation about motivation and morale. If people don't think they're achievable, doesn't matter how much you sing and dance about them, it's not achievable for them in their mindset. So we have to look at how we can stretch, how we can motivate, and how to develop. And showing people their marginal growth is really important.
Yeah,
showing
absolutely.
them how they monitor their promise is really important. And we'll touch that a little bit later.
Yeah.
This one was a really interesting. So when we start to talk about what's going on, okay, looking at your data, what can it tell you? Remember, what we start to look at data, and we're going to talk about billers first, Paul, and then we're going to talk a little bit later about clients, because I think the client one is a real big gap in lots of people's forecasting and then pulling together a budget, because they don't actually take that into account. So does your data tell you the truth? And I think we've said this on so many webinars. Data doesn't lie. And so if you looked at your average billing per head over the last 3 years, it will give you an idea on average what your billers are going to do that year. So you've got to sort of take that into account. If you then look about if you're injecting new people into the business to try bolster the gap that you've got from where your people are now to what you want their target to be, then you've got to also account in for the time it takes them get to that run rate. So as you said, they might not bill for 3 months, etc., etc. So how much time does it actually take to get them to that run rate? I see too many people saying, right, they start month 1, it'll be trained, then month 2 they're going to be doing 50%, month 3 they'll do 75%, month 4 they're now on 100% of target. That doesn't happen. Let's be right, that doesn't happen. So actually having a proper measure of what it takes to get to that required run rate is really important. The thing that when people start to plan their budgets, I find that they completely miss is, what is the attrition rate across your billers? If you're going to lose 20% of your billers, then you've got to take 20% off that target, because that's what's going to happen. Your new people coming in that will replace those 20%, they're not going to be billing anywhere near the average of that 20%, because they've got to get up to that run rate in the first place. Then you start to think about the metrics that you were talking about, the number of active candidates on your CRM. And I always think this is a different view of looking at the number of jobs that we'll talk about next. I was with a client the other day and he said he's got 19,000 live candidates on his business. And I said, how many people do you think you could place in the next 3 months? He said, well, if I looked at all of them, there's probably about 30 to 40% that I could place. Based on his average fee, that was £58 million worth of revenue sat on his CRM that he's not touching. We went to 1%, and it was something like £1.5 million if we just placed 1% of the candidates on his database. So the metrics of looking at your live candidates and the candidates that are placeable on your CRM is really important, because when you start to go to look at your job placement ratios, i.e. job to placement, CV to interview, number of CVs to jobs, etc., all those ratios, then you can start to work out how much your candidates are actually worth to you, and are your candidates worth more than your jobs? If you then look at your average billing per client, again, you can start to look at how many clients are you going to lose, how many clients are you going to maintain, how many clients are you going to grow? How many clients do you need on average to actually hit your target? Yeah. And I think the biggest thing that you always look at, and this is the what if game for me, the percentage of your top billing consultants. What happens if they don't bill, i.e. they leave? What happens if they reduce? What happens if they massively exceed target again? And so you've got to factor all of those in, and looking at all the stats that you've got will tell you, you might have, as you said before, Paul, you might have a consultant that's just hit an absolute golden patch. Maybe one client's had a big project on, maybe they've hit 2 or 3 big clients that have got projects on, but are those projects going to continue? Are they going to continue doing what they're doing? So looking at what your top consultants have been doing in the past will have an indication on whether your average is going to increase or decrease across the whole lot. And I think data now enables you to actually tap into all that information and therefore enable you to budget correctly and set proper targets and goals.
Well, I mean, data, as you rightly say, doesn't lie. And I mean, the larger the sample, in other words, as you've just said, if you go back 3 years, I mean, if it was normal 3 years, we had a year 3 years ago, it was hardly normal. But if you go typically back 2-3 years, the data that you start to collect, i.e. things like vacancies to placements, interviews to placements, all the usual standard KPIs, they won't lie. They simply won't lie. And if you stick to those numbers and you extrapolate out, so I mean, back in my day, running Office Angels, we had to do 1,000 placements a month, which is no small feat, is it? And that was a target that I didn't set. As you said earlier, it was set for me. And after I got over my initial panic, it was a question of then thinking, well, exactly what does this mean in terms of how many jobs do we need to take? How many interviews do we need to arrange? And so forth. And when I broke it down, I started to look into which particular offices could do what and who in each office could do what. It actually became quite achievable. And in fact, we made it. And the reason we made it is we followed the data. I knew daily and weekly exactly how many interviews we needed to arrange, how many jobs we needed to register, and so forth. I knew those figures to the fraction. And when we hit them or went above, I was comfortable and I had a good weekend. And when we didn't, I didn't have a good weekend. And the following week, we pushed very hard to try and retrieve the numbers. The fact that we chase those inputs produced the outputs. The great news about our industry, and I think everybody listening knows this, is it isn't, to use the old cliche, rocket science. We're not dealing here in very complicated mathematics. This is pretty simple stuff. And knowing how to just crunch those numbers and in the key areas, interviews, vacancies, and so forth, is very simple. Every CRM that any one of our clients, anybody listening here, have the ability for you guys to add up the numbers and total them, divide one into the other, and bingo, you've got those ratios for the group, for the company, for the individuals, and you can base your judgments on that and then chase those numbers on a daily, weekly basis. I'm sure everybody listening knows this stuff. Everything I've just said and what you've just said, Howard, everybody knows this stuff, but it's making sure it's embedded into your business culture. It isn't just stuff from time to time you think about and look at. It's embedded into the culture. We look at it daily. Now, whenever I use this phrase, KPIs or metrics, I very often get people go, oh, we don't like KPIs, we don't like metrics. And I get that. No, I understand from those people that what they feel is they don't want to go back to the old days where, in the old recruitment world, they were beaten up by hitting KPIs and metrics and all that. Nobody wants that. But you've also got to have tram lines. If you don't have a direction, if you don't know how you're going to get to your destination, how are you going to get there? And these metrics enable you to do that. Well, so whatever title you give them, it's important to have them. If I was a new person starting in a business and I had some understanding of recruitment, the first question I'd ask you, Howard, as my boss is, how many placements do you expect me to be making fairly soon? Great. Okay. If you say I can achieve that, that's terrific. Exactly what does that mean? How many interviews do I need? How many CVs do I need to send out? And so forth. And you should be able to give me those numbers. And if I follow those numbers, I should make, with some reasonably decent training and development, I should be able to make the placements you've set for me.
So I absolutely follow the data, but I look at it in a slightly different way because we're so obsessed with KPIs. And what we do with the KPI, we measure that KPI every single day and then smack people on the head. So it could be, Paul, you've missed your KPI day today, smash. Tomorrow you've hit it. Great. However, what I do as a manager, I look at the trends and I look every 2 weeks, are the trends going up? Are the trends flatlining? Are the trends going down? And therefore I can start to interject on a very regular basis rather than being that annoyance micromanagement on every single day. Your data gives you that information, but you're right. If you know exactly how many CVs you need to send each month, let's say you've got to say 50 CVs a month, and I know at the end of week 2, we've only sent 10, we're down on the trend, so we've got to start to book that trend up. But
Absolutely.
if we're at 30,
Yeah.
my thought process is great. We're at 30. How do I improve that trend? And I start to look at that. So I think I look at trends rather than KPIs in their truest forms
Yeah.
and work it from there.
Well,
But
just something else to add here, Howard, just before we move on to the next slide. And I was going to say this, but you talked about clients. One of the things you've got to do, I think, is that Boston Matrix thing, which we're going to get to, I think, shortly. But it's something that's important to analyze what's going on trend wise with your clients as well. And I think we'll get to that shortly anyway.
So if we start to look at that then, Paul, so we look at that, how do you get 20% growth year on year? And this is the bit where we talk about how many clients come to us and give us a budget and say, this is my strategy for the year. We go, no, they're your targets and goals for the year. This is what we talk about, the strategy behind. So goals and target without strategy is the slowest route to victory, which I just stole from Sansu's, strategy without tax is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is a noise before defeat. So if you start to think about client acquisition, candidate acquisition, client retention, candidate retention, EVP and recruitment into your business, your consultant retention, your succession planning, your product development, your tech stack, these are all the things that sit behind that are a strategy that enables you to see, well, this year I placed with 60 clients. What's my acquisition rate? What's my attrition rate? What's this look like? So do I need to find more clients? Do I need to find more businesses? Look at my candidate acquisition. What's it costing me? Is it going up? Is it going down? So all of these strategies become part of my overall view of how do I hit my objective. And that's when we start to talk about what you're talking about there, Paul, about some things like the Boston Matrix. Yeah. So if I'm looking at my candidate acquisition, I want to know which is my cash cow. Is it still going to be a cash cow next year? I want to know who are my rising stars. Am I going to get more money out of these rising stars, less money out of these rising stars? I then start to look at the question mark clients and new clients. Who do I need to build in? And then I look at my dogs and how do I get rid of my dogs? Do I, start to look at how I revive the dog, or do I start to think this dog, it actually needs to disappear because it's not working for the business? All of these things happen, but that's client retention. We start to look at candidate retention, look at our temps out working, our contractors out working. How do we retain them? Look at our perm people. How many perm candidates do we need? New perm candidates onto our system, etc. We look at our consultant retention, and that's the big conversation. If I can keep my clients and acquire new clients, but I can't keep my consultants, how am I going to actually perform? And that goes back into your succession planning. What new products are we bringing to the business? And that's where your tech stack becomes really important. And all of these things are about creating the tribe in your business that goes back to that terror of management. If we can create a tribe and everyone understands where they fit within these strategies, then you've got targets and goals and a strategy, which is the quickest route to victory.
Well, I completely agree. Look, I think when you look at this long list of things that you've got to focus on, and as you say, dig in, understand the trends, understand what's going on. Easy as a manager or as a leader to get rather overwhelmed. And I think what this talks to is making sure that each manager, each leader takes the time every week, every month, and certainly on a regular basis to step back from whatever they're doing to review where the business is at, and importantly, to be looking outside of the business. So, when we're talking about client retention, candidate retention, and acquisition of clients and candidates, this requires some real thought. It also requires a great deal of communication with your client population, with your candidate population. We look at EVP, how we develop and retain an outstanding and enviable culture as a business. That doesn't happen accidentally. That happens because people step away, who are leaders, to think about how do we improve the culture here? How do we make it a place that people want to work in and want to stay working in? Succession planning is part of that process. How do we give people the career development, the career succession to enable them to feel fulfilled, to hit their business goals? How do we do that? And so on. I mean, a lot of these things that you've put on the slide, well, all of them are extremely important. Some of them are extremely complex and need a lot of thought and development. And that's not something you do annually and then put it in your drawer. You think about these things regularly. When you read those classic executive books, Stephen Covey and various other, Peter Drucker, they all talk about leaders spending 70% of their time looking outside of the business. Now, I know that's one of those lovely cliches. None of us have ever managed that, I suspect, but it's certainly something to drive towards, trying very hard to spend time away from the desk, away from the daily minutiae, the urgent stuff that occurs on a daily basis, and just think about where the business is going and how you're going to improve it. That requires the leaders and the managers to do that. Just a bit of quiet time to use your mind and not be, as we know, drawn into the constant daily reactive situation that we all find ourselves in within the recruitment industry. So I think you're right, Howard, to outline all of these. They're incredibly important, individually and collectively, but it takes some analysis and it takes some time to think through and then share your thoughts with others around you and get their take on these situations as well.
So it's interesting, when we were both at Adecco, we were given these huge figures to actually go away and then equate down into your team to ensure you can achieve your target. But once we'd got the figures, it was this data that we drilled into. We knew what the average billing would be and how that would work. We knew what the average number of jobs that would work, etc. But to get to that, then your candidate acquisition, your client acquisition, your client retention, etc., that was really important. And the key metric I said on there was your consultant retention. I knew full well offices that had poor retention in of their staff were unlikely to hit their targets. Those that had the top retention of their staff were more than likely going to smash their targets. And so all the time we looked at all of these things all the way through the process and made it so it worked, and so we could hit our targets. So we booked the trend of trying to grow and overachieve what our paymasters were giving us, but that's because we went into all the data and looked at all the factors. And I think when we start to look at that, what we created, and certainly what you created in Office Angels, was all about repetition. If you want to create consistency to ensure growth, repetition is the mother of all learnings. And I put these down that, communication, it has to be high level, and at certain areas it has to be granular. So at a high level overview of what's everything going on, but as you get further down to each individual person, then we've got to start to talk about the granular levels. So individual people need to understand. And what Simon was talking about on there about hitting PBs, what I've put at the end there is about marginal gains. So if we can start to increase people, so if I used to work out with people, if you could send one CV or half a CV more per week, this is what it will do for your business. This is what it will do for your productivity. And so the high level was we need to hit this figure, but the granular was what made people hit the marginal gains and grow the marginal gains. We then started to look at product development, and we looked at our recruitment products. Could we sell bigger products and better products to our clients? Therefore, will they become more sticky with us and become more exclusive with us? And what helped us on that was our tech stack would tell us how long it took to make placements, what people were doing, etc. But the key to it all was training. Train the managers to help the managers deliver a better service to the consultants, and train the consultants to give a better performance. And so it was training and training. And I rolled out weekly training sessions and gave all the managers train the trainer sessions, and then gave them the material. Yep. It was interesting. The managers that actually did that week in, week out religiously hit targets. The managers that didn't invest in that tended not to. And that was all about then having the realistic expectations. So never losing sight of your strategy, never losing sight of your end goals. Okay. Review, and make sure we drive on that. And so everybody understanding that and then consistently applying it across the business day in, day out, meant that our marginal gains added together created one huge gain. And that's what we did.
I totally agree with that. Now, your point here about repetition is the mother of all learning. Now, as everybody knows, I'm learning to play the guitar at the moment. Look at the tip of my fingers. It's painful. And I'm learning to play Fast Car, Tracy Chapman, and I've said that everyone can hear the song in their head. I have gone through. There's a riff A and a riff B. I must have played these riffs. Oh God, I don't know, 500, 1,000 times. I can play that. I can play it now. I mean, when I was first shown it, I had absolutely no understanding how I was going to do it. Now I go to bed with this damn song in my head. And believe me, I can hear it as I'm talking about it. That repetition is the mother of all learning. It's just play, 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 play. And now my fingers are following the strings because it's become repetition. It's become natural. This applies, I think, to everything you've just talked about, Howard. It's constantly talking, constantly trying, and I think making sure that we keep repeat. And eventually, I think for all of us experienced people listening today, involved today, the things that we find very easy are things that we forget, that we found terribly difficult when we first started. And it's only through this constant repetition and through making certain that within a business, at the heart of everything we do, is a sense of learning and development, that we are absolutely committed to consistently developing the people in our business, whether they've got 6 months, 6 years, or 20 years. We are committed to helping them to reach the next level. There's never a point at which they know everything and they've mastered everything. There's always more they can learn and always more we can do to help them. And I think that's so important in any business. In my experience, if people feel they're being constantly developed, receiving great coaching, training, support, they stay in businesses. They do leave when they feel that they're ignored and kept in a corner and in the dark. So these are really important points you're making, Howard. And I think this whole point about training and development and communication is desperately important. The last point about product development, very important. What worked last year beautifully will have less impact this year and even less impact next year. Constantly looking at how we do things, how we change things, minor tweaks here and there make a big difference in the long run.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, as we move on to the last slide, that what we're talking about here is that realistic expectation and how that realistic expectation drives motivation. If people feel or think that they can touch it, then they'll go for it. If they feel it's too far away, then they are fearful. It's like as a small kid, isn't it, jumping over a stream. If you thought you could make it, you will make it, and you will jump and you'll go. If you didn't think you make it, you hesitate and you always ended up wet. And I found that all the time where I'm really committed to it, you'd get over when you didn't commit to it there. So the realistic expectations is really important, which leads us to that understanding of the last slide. And this is what you were trying to allude to, Paul. And I think this is understanding your gaps. So if you know what your consultant's capabilities are, then you've got to look at the outside factors that may prevent you from doing that. So the number of billing clients, who's going to stop, who's going to flatline, who's in a growth mode, what's going on. So you might have that your biggest billing client is suddenly going to stop working with you for whatever reason, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to find that money from somewhere. So you've got to look at that. You look at your existing clients, your existing clients that are there, your lapsed clients, and then you look at your new client base. So that business development becomes really important because that's got to fill the gap. And if we go by the rule of thumb that 40% of your business is always going to stop every single year, you've got to develop 40% just to stand still. That's a big chunk of business that you've got to look at. So getting more out of your existing clients, revitalizing your lapsed clients, and then looking at your new clients is really important. And that goes back to that client metrics, looking at who's a rising star, who's your question mark, who's your cash cow, and who's your dog. But it's the same with your billers. You talked about, are they going to stop? Are they going to flatline? Are they going to grow? And it's the same as about your product. What product should we stop selling? What product should we start selling? What product should we continue selling? And so when you start to put all of this plan together, you've got to think about one thing. And this is the bit that absolutely defines what we talked about probably on the first slide. Do your plans match your values and your mission statement? So if you've got written on your mission statement or on your system or on your website, etc., that one of your values is honesty, But if you're setting targets that are so far from what people think they can achieve, then you're not being honest with yourself, and nor are you being honest with your consultants. And therefore, matching your values and your mission statement back to your targets and your goals and defining everything, I think is really important. But understanding the gap in between where your consultants can get to and where your consultants need to be is important. But understanding the gap of what's going to drop out and what's going to come into your business is equally important. And to me, that value and the values that you have for your consultants and for your clients and your candidates must be the same values that you adopt when you're actually pulling together your budgets and your strategy for the following year.
Yeah, listen, that understanding of the gap is so important, and this comes back to leadership, being able to identify where your gaps are, anticipate the issues around them, and do something about them is enormously important. And you've outlined here very well the stop, start, continue, flatline growth, and so forth. All those things are super important. And as leaders, it's up to us to help our people understand where those gaps are. New business doesn't happen miraculously. And we also know, let's not forget, that 70% of new business comes from 30% of our existing client base. That tends to be the rule of thumb. So you already have the clients that will give you more business, but you're not going to get it unless you're close to them. And that means, as I've been banging on about this for a very long time, lots and lots and lots of continuous client meetings, developing your trusted advisor positioning with customers to get to a point where you own the client, you own the opportunities, you're the dominant, if not the sole supplier. These are the growth targets that we set for ourselves that happen over a period of time. Nothing happens overnight. You have to work towards these situations. So one of the things we've talked about, but just to emphasize it, is consistency. You don't just look at these things on an annual basis because it happens to be that time of the year when you're setting budgets. Consistency is about what you do on a daily basis. You're talking about developing new clients, developing your client base, growing your base, and so forth, the whole Boston Matrix thing. Absolutely, but that isn't going to happen just because we've started to do it. New clients and cross-selling and upselling opportunities come about over a period of time, and sometimes that's a year, 2, 3 years on from initial contact. It takes time. So you have to be consistently focused on being focused on your clients and candidates on a daily basis. These are the things that make a big difference. But to your point, Howard, understanding and embracing the values of your business, the vision and the goals of your business, and talking about that every day like a mantra to your people is vitally important. It's creating that tribe, as you say, that sense of belonging that people have to great businesses. Getting people's hearts and minds is so important. And I think everyone listening knows that, but it's something we can never take for granted. We've always got to be working at developing the loyalty of the people that work with us. And if you look after the people who look after you, you've got a great business, as we always say.
So as we talk about people, that's the end of today's session. Next week, we're going to talk about, is your team fit to perform next year, or are your team fatigued? So think about what we've gone through. We've gone through lockdown. We've then had the most busiest year ever, and I mean ever, in recruitment. And we're going to ask our team to go again and again. So are you looking for signs for burnout? Is the heart of your business healthy enough to go again? And how do you refresh and reinvigorate your team into going again is what we're going to talk about next week. It's that time of the year when we're getting to the end of the year. So it's the big drive to hit the end of the annual year, but it's also a massive opportunity to sort of springboard in healthy, remotivate and re-energize your staff and reinvigorate your staff to go again in 2023. So thanks very much for attending. Much appreciated. Hope you gained loads. As always, the session is recorded. It'll be on the website, hopefully by the close of business today. But I've got loads of stuff to do this afternoon with clients. But I will find some time to get it onto the website and work from there. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down to us on an email, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Paul, thanks for your input as always.
My pleasure.
See you next week.